Really nice to meet you. My name is Michele Riccardo Esposito. I'm the co-founder of Candu Labs and CTO. And it's really my pleasure to be talking to you today about how to do team building in Scala. So today we'll be covering hiring in Scala, why this is a good idea, why you shouldn't be afraid of this, and why you should, in fact, use this as your advantage when you're hiring. We will then be talking about how to effectively onboard and train people in your company on how to do Scala effectively. So one of the things that's always important, of course, is that when you actually hire the people, that they can be very productive doing Scala quickly. And then finally, we'll be talking about how to retain and how to grow your teams that are, in fact, using Scala. And finally, we'll have some time for Q&A. Looking forward to a lot of good questions. But before we jump into that, I'd love to tell you a little bit more about me. So as I said, I'm Michele, co-founder of CTO Labs, and I'm also an ex-TransferWise, or Wise, as it is known now. And I'm also a former Coursera employee. I started there first as an infrastructure engineer, then as a product engineer. And I'm also the winner of the 1993 Oversized Hat Award, which obviously means that I'm really professional in Scala, because look how cute I was at the baby. No, just kidding. But one thing that's interesting about my experience is that I've had the chance to work a lot with Scala throughout these many years and across a lot of different sizes of company. So really, my first experience with Scala was back in 2010 or 12, sorry, wrong date, but I've been doing Scala since 2.10, if anyone remembers that. And I first did Scala when I was back at University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. I used it in a number of projects and teams while I was in the university, and so I kind of have a bit of experience working on it and as research projects and similar things, which I think is something that a lot of folks will have in Scala. Then I had the experience to work with Scala at Coursera. So this is something quite different from, of course, working in a more research setting at university. So when I joined Coursera was about 40, I left was about 250. And we kind of went through a phase of hyper growth, which is where a lot of that initial experience of scaling teams, looking how teams adopt Scala worked. And one thing that was quite interesting of Coursera at the time is that Coursera was switching from using PHP and Django as their primary backend onto Scala. So also seeing a lot of that transition was really interesting for me and really informed this talk. But really, the idea of this talk was born out of my experience at Candu. So I started Candu back in 2010, and by the way, I should say we are hiring. Please email me at Michele@Candu. It wouldn't be a tech talk without this slide, so you know what's coming. So I started Candu back in 2018, and it's Candu is a complex product. It is a no-code editor that you can embed. You can create user interfaces and user experiences and embed them in your product. So when I started Candu, I had some choices around what language I wanted to use. And the first choice that I had, given my background and what I was comfortable with, was to use Node and Express. Now, this is a great language. It's a great combination, and we actually use this a lot in certain situations in serverless settings or stuff like that. But I didn't feel comfortable having this as a primary language, and I could have also used Django and Python. But again, because of that experience working at Coursera, I wanted something that was a lot more that was type safe, that had quite different characteristics. So one thing with Canvas is quite heavy on data processing, and this is something that Scala does extremely well. Being a type safe language, having tons of really great libraries, being built on the JVM, is really, really good at doing all these things. Scala is also amazing if you need to build fast with little resources, which was why I initially picked it as our primary language. Because, well, originally it was just me doing Scala, right? Because I was the primary person when we were just a team of 2 people doing engineering. And also wanted, as mentioned, a type-safe language, one that handles asynchronous operations really well. And so in short, Scala and Play were an amazing combination for what I wanted to achieve. Play is a great framework, Scala is a great language, and so this was a great combination. And after we raised money, I then had to start creating a team. And by the way, for those of you who have raised money, this is kind of how it feels like after you finally get the money from your investment. You're like, oh my God, I worked so hard to try and raise a fund, and then I have all this money that's being thrown at me, and I needed to create a team. And this is where, this is where my experience, this is where this talk really started. At this point where I now needed to scale the team from zero entirely in Scala. And I started doing this, in 2019, 2018, when Scala, back when I worked at Coursera, Scala was really popular. It was kind of the tech darling. Everyone was talking about it. It was new. The buzz was out there. But back in 2018 and 19, when I started talking to candidates about why Scala, this is generally the reaction that I got. Why would anyone do that? Like, that's such an old language, right? I was like, no. And so I kept having, to explain why this is actually a really good idea to still use Scala to create this, and how overall it's gone really well for Camdo, and why, you should tell your startup friends and many other companies that actually, yeah, Scala is a great choice to build teams, to scale teams, and to do a lot of great engineering work. So let's talk about hiring in Scala. Is it a good idea? Oh yeah, absolutely. Now, there are some things that you need to keep in mind when hiring in Scala that I think are quite important. And the first one is, how do you source Scala candidates? So one of the caveats that I think a lot of people, one of the pushbacks that I had, right, was people were just like, hey, you're building a team in Scala. They're really little Scala developers. They're so hard to find. And the trick here is that, well, you don't have to hire Scala developers. You can hire developers from different languages, and you'll be able to onboard them very quickly and be really productive right away. It actually is so much easier to onboard people onto Scala than what people think. And so some of the tricks that we've learned is you need to identify the right people that have a good background to bring them into Scala and for them to be able to learn quickly. So one of the things is that it's important to find people that have had some exposure to functional programming. So this, of course, is kind of obvious, right, for anyone who has done Scala, but if somebody has exposure to functional programming, it will be a lot easier for them to learn how to do Scala. And nowadays functional programming has gotten really mainstream, so this is actually quite easy to find, right? Because programming, like things like TypeScript and things like JavaScript, of course, UVS6. So many languages have so many constructs of functional programming built in. Now, of course, it's not quite as comprehensive. All those languages have a lot of side effects and things, but but it's still, having people that are really familiar with higher level programming and stuff really helps onboard them in quickly. It's also great if they have some sort of object-oriented programming in their back pocket. This is where, for example, oftentimes what I've seen is that if people that have only done JavaScript, they do have often a good background in functional programming, but they will struggle with the object-oriented programming part of Scala. So if you can find people that have both experiences and maybe also have a little bit of background into statically typed language with an ML type syntax, right? Or with an ML type compiler, even though they haven't done Scala, they have all the elements. They've had all the exposure, and there's a lot of people out there with this type of background. Java or a highly imperative language isn't necessarily the best background, and I think this is especially true for people that have been on the job market for a longer time, right? Now, this is of course not true for everyone. Some of the really best people that I've hired were Java devs with 10, 15 years of experience. But generally speaking, I have found that it's really, it has been quite hard if somebody has been doing things in a really different way for a long period of time, it can be difficult to change those ways, right? Because overall, like, they will be quite set in that mindset, and it's not always, it can take a lot longer. Whereas I found that oftentimes people that are a bit more junior can learn a new paradigms faster and things. But of course, this is where having a comprehensive interview process is important, so that you can make sure that you still need to hire these from people. The other thing that's quite useful that I found is that Play Framework, for those who are familiar, is a really nice, and I love Play Framework. It's such a good framework, and it's quite similar to Django and Ruby on Rails in many ways. And that's a great thing. It means that you can hire people that have that background, and they will be familiar going into a framework like Play because they already know so many of the patterns. So if you find people that have those experiences, that's always a really good plus. It tells me that their adaptation process to Scala will be easier and faster. And finally, the other thing to keep in mind when hiring for Scala is that, yes, Scala devs are indeed harder to find than, say, for example, React developers, that they're really popular now, and there's so many of them. However, to some extent, somebody who has 5 years experience doing Scala is likely to be a very good dev, and is likely to have had a lot of exposure to different types of programming languages, to have done lots of really interesting things. And I found that generally speaking, the hiring pool for, if you are looking for hire people that have previous experience in Scala, yes, it is smaller, but it's normally a really good pool. So my funnels normally are, in the end, they tend to be still really good because, yes, I don't need to hire as many people. I don't need to interview as many people up top the funnel. And in the end, the bottom of the funnel will still be quite good. Now, the next key insights here is how do you interview people in Scala? So obviously, this really depends on the role that you're hiring, on your stack, on your processes as a company. And honestly, we could be talking about this for many hours, really. I did want to share, though, a couple tips, a couple things that I found useful across many different companies and background and types of projects. So one thing is you should try to test good knowledge of type programming. So you should check that these people do have, you should check that they have had some level of background to thinking in terms of data types, and they can be familiar with this, and as well with higher level programming. And one thing, sorry, the slides cut out here. I don't know why, but one thing that is really useful also when interviewing people in Scala that I found is also that you want to be able to, one of the mistakes that I've done is that we got a bit too abstract sometimes. What do I mean? So when somebody hasn't done, if you are interviewing people that have not done Scala in the past, you obviously want to look for all those elements that we have looked in the previous slide. So you want to look at people that, have had functional programming experience, that have had object-oriented programming experience, that have had exposure to the JVM. And I think here in the interview process, you should try and get really practical about testing those things. One of the mistakes that we have done in the past is basically being like, okay, well, we can, they have not done Scala. Let's try to be a bit higher level. Let's try to be a little bit abstract. And that has resulted in a number of hires that have not gone the right way. So try to get really practical about testing those things that I put in the previous slide. Try to make even some exercises and really try to narrow down on the skill set, because those, in my experience, if you can prove that the candidate will perform well in those things, then he will have a much higher likelihood of onboarding quickly onto your stack and onto Scala. And finally, the other funny thing that I've had to do recently is convincing a candidate to learn Scala, which is something that I didn't used to do. I didn't used to have to do as much back in 2013, 14, 15. But nowadays, because Scala isn't quite as hyped as it used to be, a lot of candidates often ask me, well, why should I do this, right? And so some of the arguments that I have for them is that, well, matter of fact, Scala is one of the languages that commands the highest salary. That's pretty nice for you. So this is really nice because, it's very objective, right? They can do their research and verify this. And this can be a good motivating factor to make sure that, yes, they are actually investing their time in a very valuable skill that will be there for the rest of their career and that is proven to have good return of investment, right? So I found that this is a good way to help people, remind them that Scala is indeed a language that is worth learning from a career perspective. From a learning perspective, it's also good to remind them that this is it's a complex language, but this is learning these new paradigms will make you a better programmer. Scala has a lot of unique constructs that are not in other languages that are really cool and really useful. And so, for example, I often draw my experience being a Scala developer and a JavaScript developer on how a lot of Scala concepts have made me a much better JavaScript developer. And so, bringing that experience to the table has really helped me convince a number of candidates that yes, this is in fact, something that you should strive to learn, that will make you better, that will improve your career. And the other thing, I try to really explain them why I chose Scala as a language, why this makes sense. And ultimately, a lot of the decisions is that teams in Scala tend to be highly productive. When I hire, one of the reasons I chose Scala is that I didn't, if I knew that if I grew a team in Scala, I would not have had to hire as many developers to get the same level of things done. And that has turned out to be true in Candu. And for a candidate, this is really important because productivity is everything when you join a company, right? Ultimately, how productive you are kind of determines how happy you are in a company. So making sure that they can feel that this will be something that they can onboard and they will be able to produce code and contribute quickly will be of great insurance. And the last thing is people often have objections to switching onto Scala and learning onto Scala when joining a company because they're afraid, right? Scala is an intimidating language, oftentimes. Let's be honest. They've heard a lot of things about how complex it is, how difficult it is, and so you want to reassure them that, hey, look, actually, I've done this many times. In Candu, actually, almost all the engineers that do Scala have never done Scala before. And so that's really reassuring for a lot of engineers that, yes, you can actually learn this. Yes, this is easy enough to learn and you'll be able to be productive. I've done this. I know how to do this. Here's a plan for you on how to onboard. And that really helps bringing these people on with you and be willing to learn Scala. Now, I did want to share some of the objections that I've gotten from candidates when talking about why they should learn Scala and why they should invest in it. And most common is, well, isn't Scala dead? And this is a really funny one, right? I think it's just kind of the hype of Silicon Valley and all things new. But no, Scala is not that. Of course, we just have Scala 3, which is an amazing new version. The community is thriving. There's so many projects thriving. And I think this is just, like people are often not informed about this. But once they look into it a little bit more, it's quite easy for them to see that this is indeed a great community. Just, this is extremely live and it does, it is indeed like a good investment for them. This is actually the second most popular question that I get, right? How are you going to find talent for it? And this is again where it's important to explain them how you're planning on doing this, right? We have an idea. When we chose Scala, we were aware, and so just taking time and explaining people, why you think is actually easier than not. You can also use my presentation if you want to explain them why it is actually easy to find talent for it. Has made the conversation so much easier for me, and overall has been fairly easy to go to convince people that yes, indeed it is easy enough to hire and find people to do Scala. Another one, of course, that I already mentioned, a lot of people think Scala is really difficult. And I normally use this as an opportunity to upsell as well. So on top of explaining all the tips that I told you in the previous slide, this is a great opportunity to explain them some of the technical background behind the company they're joining. So I would normally explain them why we chose Scala at this point. I would explain them some of the ideas that we implement in our code base on how to make it easy for everyone to write Scala. And I'll be talking more about this in a second onto the onboarding session. And overall, I try to go into a lot of details. Remember, you're still in the interviewing process here. You want to make sure that candidates feel really reassured that they can pick these skills up, that they feel like they can come along for the ride and they don't feel intimidated. So here, explain very thoroughly, why you chose it, what's your strategy to onboard people, what are the key elements, go into detail, tell them why, they've passed all the interviews, obviously, so they're more than qualified. And reassure them you've done this many times, you know how to do this, and they'll be able to get on with it. Now, the last objection is a really funny one. I'd never thought I would get this, but I did actually get it several times, not too often, to be honest, but it has come up, which is people have told me, hey, like Scala is a language for bankers and for academics and things like this. The bankers is particular. This is because Scala is used a lot in the financial sector here in London, where I'm based. So a lot of big businesses do use Scala, hence it's a language for bankers. And honestly, this one is just a little bit funny, I normally tell them, yes, they do, because it's a great language and they're really smart people and, welcome to the club. So really, this one is fairly easy to get through. Now, next I want to talk about how to think about onboarding and training somebody that you have just hired. Again, the bulk of this is really around, how do you bring people that have not done Scala onto Scala quickly in a startup setting, right? So, being kind of a small company, we need to be able to have people productive very quickly, right? The target for us is normally they need to be productive on a code base within 1 or 2 months, right? But often a lot less. So it's very important that we have really precise plans on how to actually convert these hires into really successful engineers in Camdo. The first thing is, of course, the dev environment. I mean, all of us spend tons of time setting dev environments and making sure it's well documented. And this is obviously not something that's unique with Scala, but it's particularly important when you hire people that do not have that background before, right? When we onboard people that only do JavaScript, well, it's really easy for them. They just read package.json. Most people know how to work through Node. It's very simple. They can get started quite quickly. For Scala, you need to make sure to provide very good documentation, because of course a lot of those people will not be familiar, and so investing in a good onboarding guide is something that will pay off big dividends. One of the things that we try really hard is when onboarding somebody is we want to make sure that they will be able to do one commit in the first day. And this is quite important because, again, we want to make sure that these people can feel productive in Scala as early as possible. So we normally just give them like super easy task, so really a trivial task. But the idea here is just we want to make sure that your environment is set up, that you go over that big hill, that you can do SBT and all of this, that you can set up everything. And so having that goal is normally really useful. So another thing is SBT can be a little bit intimidating, I found, for quite a bit of people. And there are also lots of like little tricks, such as like tilde for commands or compile, that these are small things, but they really help improve the experience of those that are onboarding onto a new dev environment. The other thing that I found is that if you are hiring people that do not have JVM experience, it's really useful if you just sit with them and help them set up IntelliJ. And this is something that actually insisting that they use IntelliJ normally pays dividend. So yes, it is a little bit scary for people to learn and get adapt to a new IDE, and it is a little bit of a hurdle. So I have found some level of resistance from people not wanting to use IntelliJ. But if you do help them set it up, set the Scala extension, set the key maps and things, showing them how to use IntelliJ really pays off big dividends in terms of onboarding somebody quickly, because they will just be a lot more productive in that language. And again, I think for people that do not come from a Java background, that don't know how much refactoring, how good the refactoring functions is, and all these things, actually making sure that you really help them learn the tooling very quickly early on is really going to pay dividends in terms of their productivity in the early days. And the final thing is get them familiar with the Scala console and with the interactive sheets in IntelliJ. These are great tools for people that want to learn. One thing, for example, is when I set up a lot of people's IntelliJ, when they're starting in Scala, they might not be as familiar with the error codes that they come up on compiling, and IntelliJ sometimes cuts. If the error code is a little bit involved, it sometimes cuts them a bit. So just seeing them on the console, I found that often helps people see those console, those error message better, and again, just gets them more familiar and on how the language works, and kind of helps them get over some hurdles. Now, the next thing that we normally do after we get them to do one commit is we start onboarding them onto the key features of Scala. So now we're starting to get a bit more into the weeds rather than just into the tooling. So here it's quite important to identify what are the essential things in my code base. What are the paradigms that we use over and over in our code base that people need to know to be able to be productive in this language? So then the other thing is you want to spend time to do some pair programming. When onboarding onto a new language, a new ecosystem, you want to be really hands-on. And this really helps speed up that process. And in particular, we have found that assigning, we call it a Scala friend, can be really beneficial. So another developer that has learned Scala on the job and is there to pair program, to work through these issues with you, and he will be dedicating in the first or 2 weeks, would be super helpful. And some of the pushback that I've got from other CTOs or other people about this is like, well, that's a long time frame. Like, you want to dedicate somebody to do this? And it's like, yeah, I mean, you're scaling your team. This is your number one priority. And also, to be honest, I found that it really doesn't take that long. I mean, normally, the Scala friend will be quite hands-on on the first week, but after the second or the third week, they will be a lot more hands-off. And then, they will just have basically additional help, but normally it doesn't take very long for them to start picking up. And finally, the last thing that we've found super helpful is to encourage people to think in terms of types. So this is especially true for those that come from dynamically typed language or more imperative language. One of the things that's amazing about Scala is that it's both functional programming and object-oriented. And so generally, it forces you to kind of think in terms of types, right? I'm sure a lot of you have experienced this, but it's important to try and get new people to think in that mindset. So one thing that I often try to ask them is write down, look at this expression and try to write down on a piece of paper what types do you think this results to. And that kind of encourages them to develop that type thinking, I like to call it. And another useful trick here is to show them how to look up types in IntelliJ. Again, fairly obvious, but not a lot of, people that are not familiar with the ecosystem will not notice. So I now want to walk you through a practical example of some of the key features that we teach in Scala and kind of the order in how we teach them at Scala. So the first thing that we teach are options. We do a lot of asynchronous programming. We do a lot of database access. We do a lot of data validation. So options are literally everywhere in our code base. And so teaching people options is super helpful. It's really the first thing. And also I think conceptually people, once they understand options, which are quite easy to understand for most people, they're really amazed at, they start to become a lot more enthusiastic about learning Scala because options are so amazing. All of, programmers, we all know null pointer issues, so we all have had those experiences. So showing them options and, they normally get really excited. Then the next one is futures. This is actually where somebody with a JavaScript developer tends to pick up futures pretty quickly because they're quite used to promises. So it's not a foreign concept to them. For comprehension is a little bit harder normally to understand because it's a very, is a much more, is not a very widely used construct in programming languages, but is basically, to use options and futures, you kind of need for comprehensions in a lot of cases. And finally, we then teach implicits, which is a quite Scala unique concept. Implicit, I found that normally takes some time for people to get used to, but they do tend to go, but yes, it still can be taught fairly simply. And finally, we tend to, we do an overview of the generics and the type system. And finally, we go on to more specific Scala, specific things about how we use Scala at Canvas. So JSON serialization of Play framework is, of course, a really important one with case classes and all of that. And then we cover some internal frameworks that we have built. And finally, I want to share with you a little bit of tricks into adopting Scala at a larger scale. So one thing that I found that is particularly important into this conversation of identifying key features is that you want to make sure that you manage a Scala code base quite well. And in particular, Scala is a super powerful language, and with that, you get great responsibilities, of course. Thank you, Spider-Man. So one thing is we try to maintain quite strict coding guidelines. Here we basically try to limit complexity of Scala to make sure that a lot of the business logic is written without using really complex features, right? So, for example, most of the Scala code that we have is pretty, only uses implicit futures, options, and the JSON serialization, right? So those items that I put on the board, those are kind of, I'd say 80 to 90% of the code base. You only need to understand those to contribute quite effectively. And The other thing with coding guidelines, this is also from a linter perspective, right? You want to make sure that your code is very uniform. You want to make sure that it looks the same, so that it's just easier for people to adopt and approach. Now, one caveat with this is I've seen companies that when they do this approach of limiting Scala features, they basically just use Scala as if it was Java, right? So they basically, one company in particular that I remember that I work for, that I work with, actually prohibited using for comprehension and prohibited using like a lot of and then it's like, well, just use Java then. Like don't use Scala if you're just looking for like some, so make sure that you do retain all the Scala-ness, right? Don't strip down features of the Scala programming language. Just make sure you have well-defined complexity boundaries. So, for example, at Candu, we still use, really advanced, Scala features. Like we do have some implicit classes with implicit conversions that do DSLs. We still use macros, black boxes, and white, and all those really advanced features, but they are shielded for most developers. Only one or two of us need to worry about those. All the other folks that contribute to Scala don't need to know about them. They don't need to care about them. They're quite isolated. So try to make sure that your Scala code is clean, is simple, complexity is encapsulated, and what I found is that will lead to teams being so productive in Scala that they will bring Scala to their next job site when they leave. So thank you very much for listening. And are there any questions from the audience?
Hey, Michele, thank you so much for your presentation today. We've got a handful of questions, so let's jump into them. The first question, do you think coding exercises or take-home coding tasks are a good way to evaluate a candidate during technical interviews?
Yeah, so this is a great question. It really depends, I think, on your company culture and the team culture of your team and what the requirements of your job are. I'm personally not a big fan of them. So before we get into that, are they a good way to evaluate a candidate during a technical interview? Yes, they are. They most often are. The real question with coding exercise, with take-home coding question, though, is are they a fair way to evaluate a candidate during a technical interview? This is where it gets more complex with take-home tests. And the thing with this is, the problem with take-home tests is that so much of take-home tests is how much time you can put into those tests, right? And so they tend to bias people that have a lot more time available to solve for those tests. So, if you are maybe a parent that has two children, you're interviewing while on a full-time job, you have a lot of responsibilities. It's not about you being committed to my company. It's just going to be realistically really difficult for you to spend 5 hours doing my take-home test. And it's also really time to, I've seen them being done with some 1 hour time limit or things like that, but then you might as well just do it on a whiteboard. That's my personal view. So are they a good way? Yes, they are. Are they a fair way to evaluate a candidate? They can be. I think they can be fair if you have a candidate who really performs poorly under pressure. Then I think for those, you might want to consider them because it's a good way to hand them out. But I think really is a matter of your company, of the type of process that you want to run, and just balancing those issues that I address in your interview process.
Thank
Good
you. I
question.
think
I
those
love
are
this one.
some, yeah, that was a fantastic question. And I think that could be something that spans across hiring processes,
Yeah,
not just in the technical field, but
yeah,
others as
yeah, for
well.
sure.
All right, let's go to our next question. Is Scala what is hard to learn, or is it writing in a functional way? One can write Scala in a more imperative way, and that's still Scala. Dealing, for instance, with cats is a different experience.
Yeah, absolutely. And so this is where I think is important to maintain. This is why I had that slide about Scala-ness, right? Like you want to make sure that you write Scala like Scala in a functional way, right? And that you do maintain that, or that functional programming and objective oriented programming, because otherwise you're not going to see as many of the benefits, right? You might as well pick a language that has a larger talent pool, that's a little bit easier if you're not going to find people, if you're not going to get all the benefits of using Scala. That being said, I personally don't use cats. I'm a little bit, there are really complex libraries in Scala. Again, try to define boundaries for that complexity, right? If you are looking people to write really complex, very functional dependent Scala, then I think you have to adapt your hiring process for it. So yes, is you. I think these are things that you need to balance in your code base, and you need to be very mindful about this when hiring a candidate and when laying out your code base.
Wonderful. Thank you. Our next
Absolutely.
question says, what do you tell Kotlin people that think nullable types are better than options?
Options rule, but what can I say? Like, yeah. Yeah, I think Kotlin is interesting because I have had a number of candidates that, for example, were just like, no, I'm just gonna learn Kotlin instead of Scala because that's the new hype. And sometimes if somebody has made their mind, they have made their mind. I mean, that's how life goes.
Not much you can do about it, I
Not much you can
suppose.
do about that. Yeah.
All right, our next question. How do you ensure engineers that are onboarding those new to Scala don't get overwhelmed or stressed out?
Great question. First and foremost, they need to be part of the interviewing process, and they need to be part of the decision-making process during interview. I'd say that's by far the best way to avoid that. Personally, I remember, when I have had a number of candidates that I onboarded that didn't work out. And whenever I wasn't involved in the decision-making process, I got frustrated so much faster, right? Because, but if you are involved and committed to those people from the get-go, then I think it's a lot easier to make sure that they will not get stressed out or overwhelmed. So I think that's really the main one. There are other things that you can do, which is you can rotate them. So you can rotate Scala friend once a week. You should also make sure that you allocate time during sprint planning for onboarding. I think this is probably one of the things that I've learned how to do this later on. That basically, a lot of times it's like, oh, cool, I'm onboarding somebody and I'm gonna have a full sprint. Well, that's not realistic. Like you're onboarding somebody, you're expected to be spending, 75% of your time the first week onboarding that person. And the thing is, the sooner you spend that time, like you're still gonna have to spend that time, right? Regardless, like whether you spend it over 2-3 weeks or a month, you're still gonna have to spend that time. So the sooner you spend it, the better return of investment is going to give you, because the person will have a much better experience joining your company. And that results in happier people, more productive people, and then everyone's happy.
Great. Well, we have a list of questions still, but I'd like to do just one more live before we run short on time here. So, why do you think Scala is intimidating as a new programming language for developers? Is there any specific set of features that gives candidates such a feeling?
Yeah, great question. So, in my experience, the most intimidating feature is implicits. Because implicits are not a common pattern. And in my experience is also like implicits can be abused so hard in Scala, right? Because you can do implicit classes, you can do implicit conversions that then pollute your scope, and all of a sudden you have so much magic that's really hard to understand in your code base. So, for example, one of the things that we used to do at Coursera and we also do at Candu is we whitelist how many we whitelist the wildcards that you can import in your code, right? And we do that because basically we want to be explicit about the DSLs that you import, because DSLs in Scala, the domain specific, more often than not, they're done creating implicit classes and implicit conversions, right? So that's yeah. I'd say if I had to say one feature that is, I think my developers just retain less and they just find intimidating implicits 100%. They're awesome, by the way. I love implicits. Like I wish every language had them. Don't get me wrong.
Great. Well, Michele, thank you so much for your time today. Let's connect to get the remaining questions answered because there are still quite a few.
Absolutely.
And I hope you have a wonderful rest of the day and get to enjoy the rest of the conference.
Thank you very much. And thank you for listening.